Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Catholic Talk. I'm really delighted to be joined today by Father Jason Charron, who is a Ukrainian Catholic priest in Pittsburgh in the USA, if I'm correct. And well, first of all, Father Jason, thanks very much for being with me.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor.
And the first thing I want to ask you, Father, is how does somebody who is raised in the USA, and if I'm mistaken, please do correct me, but wasn't really raised in a particular religious family, maybe you were, I'm not sure. How does somebody then become a Ukrainian Catholic priest?
The same way you see a beautiful woman and you marry her.
Oh, okay.
So I was raised up in Canada, actually, in Peterborough, which is a small town outside of Toronto. And I had a conversion halfway through high school, entered seminary, did 4 years of seminary, had a spiritual director who was bi-ritual, and he was Latin Rite, Roman Catholic, but he would encourage me to look into the East. And I really didn't think too much of it. I was more suspicious than attracted to Eastern Christianity. But he prevailed upon me, and one summer I went over and taught English in Ukraine and fell in love with the Ukrainian Church, her martyrs, her catacomb witness, of course, her liturgy and prayers. I met my wife there, which accelerated the process. So I ended up finishing my 4th year of seminary, lived in Ukraine for 3 years, changed rites, which is rather easy to do if you marry someone who is Eastern Rite, and entered seminary, did 4 more years of theology, and 8 years in total, and was ordained. But yeah, it was really just the absolute immersion in the beauty of the ancient church. It wasn't so much East or West, it was the ancient aspect of it. Things that I thought were Eastern really weren't Eastern. They were just ancient. And that really appealed to me. Pre-feasts, post-feasts, a strict fast, the prevalence of chant in the liturgy, an ascetical life. All of that just really appealed to me.
Do you think that some of the things that you find in Latin traditional mass would have appealed to you in the same way? Is that something maybe you weren't exposed to at the time, or do you think this is just completely different and it just appealed to you in a different way, to even Latin mass?
I had not been to a high Latin mass until I was 40 years old. When I was in my 20s, I attended a low mass once. You have to understand that in the 1980s, 90s, it was very difficult to find a traditional mass in Canada. And you would have to travel 2-3 hours. So I never had exposure to it. So I can't answer the question really. I don't know how I would have reacted, but as a 46, 47-year-old man looking back, I think that it would have greatly appealed to me. Just the sense of the transcendence of God, the direct connection to the tradition, the life of fasting and feasting, the invocation, the repetition, the invocation of the Trinity. All of that appeals to me. And I think, looking back on my 19-year-old self, it would have really struck a chord with me. But for, reasons that only God knows, I had no experience of that. And here I am.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Father, I'm going to be ashamed to say that my knowledge on the Eastern Catholic Church is not so great. So if you could enlighten me and maybe on any other viewers who feels similarly to me. What the big differences are between the Latin Church in the West and the Eastern churches, and if there's any differences also between the Eastern churches that are maybe more than just ethnic differences. But let's start with sort of the Latin Church and the Eastern churches. What are the main differences that we'll see?
Great question. I understand, first of all, how you and your viewers feel, because you look at the Eastern churches, rationally, yeah, they check off the box of Catholic, and that they're Catholic, but how they're Catholic and how this is manifested, that's kind of, it's unusual for a lot of people. So let me answer that by first using the example of ingredients. People in Italy, people in Germany, people in Poland, for generations, from the very beginning, have had exposure to flour, yeast, salt, and water. Same ingredients, but these ingredients have taken on different forms in different cultures. And if you look in Germany, you look in Italy, you look in Poland, those cultures produce bread, which, the German bread is different than Italian bread, and so on and so forth. And so it is with the faith. The faith of the Catholics in Italy, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, the ingredients are the same. It's the apostolic faith that our Lord handed once to the apostles for the salvation of the world, and how that manifests itself is unique in each different culture. Let me just turn off this phone. I'm sorry. I apologize about that.
No problem.
So they have that's the kind of the overview in terms of the differences. To answer your question, the emphasis on the papacy is a key difference. The West views Catholicity as coming from communion with Rome, and if you're in communion with Rome, deriving from that is your Catholicity. The East does not view it that way. We view the papacy as the visible guarantor of unity with Christ's church and with the successor of Peter. But the faith, the Catholic faith, was given once for all, and it has spread out from every city, from Jerusalem to every city in the ancient world, every major city in the ancient world. And that faith is it's Eucharistic, it's sacramental, it's centered on the resurrection, on apostolic succession, and that is the Catholic faith. The role of the Bishop of Rome was to be the kind of the last court of appeal in times of heresy, in times of administrative dispute, and to preside in love. But it wasn't the source of Catholicity. That is something that's unique and proper to Christ's church. Just like, you can be, if you're Orthodox, it's an apostolic church. You don't need to be in communion with one of the patriarchs of the East to be an apostolic church. So long as you have apostolic succession, you can say this is an apostolic church. And the same as with the Eastern churches. Their Catholicity goes back to the Lord, but the view that the West has is that Catholicity derives from the papacy. That simply is not the Eastern view. We view that it's something that's grassroots and grows up from the apostolic era onward. But that communion with the Bishop of Rome is critically important for the visible manifestation of the unity of believers. The other thing that is distinctive, I'd say, is the theology of the Trinity. The West tends to focus on the unity of the Trinity, one God, and from that we come to see that within this one God there are three divine persons, co-eternal. In the East, our starting point is different. The East tends to emphasize the plurality of the persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then arrives at the affirmation of the oneness of God. So they both East and West affirm the unity of God. Both East and West affirm, the three persons of the Trinity. The starting points are rather different. And a third point, if I could, we could speak for hours on this. So I just wanted to kind of put it into neat categories: ecclesiology, view of the papacy; in Trinitarian theology, view of the Trinity; and then obviously we'd like to speak about the view of man, and that is very distinctive. The view of man and nature. The West tends to look at, when they use the term nature, to refer to the status quo post Adam and Eve, the post-lapsarian state of the world. That's often referred to as nature. The East does not view nature in that sense. The East, when I say East, I'm referring to the Byzantine East, would tend to see our nature more in line with the way that Adam and Eve were made and how they existed in the pre-lapsarian state. Critical difference. So, for example, when you see Christ performing these miracles, walking on water, you're healing the sick, all of these things, I think the East would be quicker just to point out and say, this is the new Adam embodying true nature, our true anthropology, as made in God's image and likeness. This is man fully alive. This is what the human person was made to do in God's image and likeness, to have dominion over creation and over the animals and the air and the waves of the sea. So it's these miracles of Christ are as much a function of his humanity. Because of that, we view our life in this world as a process of what the East calls deification, which makes some Westerners a little nervous because they hear that and they think of yogis trying to through transcendental meditation make us into gods or Brahmas, but that's not what we mean by it. We mean that which Saint Irenaeus of Lyon meant when he said that the glory of God is man fully alive, that we become by grace what God is by nature. And this refers, of course, to the excerpt from Peter's letter, where he says that we become partakers of the divine nature, partakers of the divine nature. And that is a unique attribute of Eastern spirituality, is this recapitulation of all things in Christ. And we, men and women, share in that by becoming gods by grace, not by nature. That's only God. And reacquire that original nature that God had intended for Adam, but then a step above by sharing in Christ. He is the vine and we are the branches. So that's a distinct element that you will find in the East view of man and woman.
Okay.
And
yeah.
that is a distinction of emphasis. The West will speak about that as well. It won't use the term deification. The West will speak about sanctification, and that is seen more by, sharing in God's graces, and filling up and transforming a flawed nature. But anyhow, I don't want to get too much into that, but different terms.
Yeah, no, that's That's very interesting. So just because you were mentioning earlier about how it seems as though, Rome would see it as it kind of flows from them, and then all these other churches are in union with Rome, and that makes them, or in communion with Rome. Whereas the Eastern churches think that Rome and the Eastern churches are just all kind of in communion with Christ in a way. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Um, does that mean that Eastern Catholic churches, do they have like their own catechism, or do they care about the catechism from Rome, for example?
Yes. So in England, I imagine most of your viewers are English, but
There's a lot from the USA, actually.
okay, well, I'll use two examples. So in England, you have the King of England, who is the head of the church, and he's also figuratively also the head of government, correct?
Yep.
And here in the United States, you have the president, who is the chief executive of the federal government, and he is also the commander in chief of the military. Two hats, one man. And it's the same with the papacy. And what I mean by that is that the Bishop of Rome is the head of the Western Church up until Benedict's, the second year of Benedict's papacy. He was known as the Patriarch of the West, and he is also the the head of the Universal Church, visibly. And so sometimes things come from Rome, and people think that it pertains to the Universal Church, when in fact he's simply speaking as the head of the Latin Church. John Paul II's universal encyclical, besides the Church's universal encyclical, which was promulgated, I think, in 1992, was a universal catechism of the Church. And that applies to the entire church. And you'll know that most people, I think, will know that it was stated that this will be the encouragement and model necessary, the impetus necessary for local churches to base their own particular catechisms upon. And so from that, you have the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, about 4 years ago, officially promulgated its English language catechism. So to answer your question, the Ukrainian Catholics have a catechism that's unique to the Eastern liturgical, spiritual, and canonical tradition, and it was very much based upon the Universal Catechism of the Church. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but yeah, we accept, obviously, the Universal Catechism of the Church because it pertains to the whole Catholic Church. But smaller national conferences of bishops and particular churches, Eastern churches, are encouraged to use that template to develop catechisms for their own people.
Got it. Understood. Let me give you another sort of similar question then. So, for example, when the Latin Church approves an apparition, so we'll have Marian apparitions, and then the Church will approve some of them. Does that matter in any way to Eastern Catholics, that it's been approved by the Church, this apparition?
Yeah, it matters to Eastern Catholics as much as it matters to Western Catholics. If an apparition has been approved by the Universal Church, then all Catholics, whether they're Chaldean, Maronite, Byzantine, Ukrainian, Latin, are able to have a devotion to that particular apparition. Now, it goes without saying that people tend to have a piety for those apparitions which are native to their land. So you're not going to see as much enthusiasm for Our Lady of Fatima in Lebanon as you will in Portugal. But they're free and encouraged to find their own devotional energy, if you will, their devotional piety in apparitions that are approved by the church.
Got it. Okay. I want to move on. Just before I move on to the very sad situation going on in Ukraine, I just want to ask, because some Polish people that I know that think that, at least think they know something about Ukraine, have this idea that in Ukraine, the Catholic faith isn't doing so great. They seem to sort of think it's similar to Russia in the sense that because of the way the systems were in the Soviet times, it's really kind of crushed the faith. Is that true in Ukraine, or is that not true at all? It's actually doing really well and flourishing.
I want to state this categorically once and for all. That is a complete lie. I was there the day after the invasion end of February 2022. I was back there in the end of May, beginning of June in 2022. I lived there for 3 years in the late 90s, early 2000s. I've been involved in all things Ukrainian since 1998. My family's from Ukraine. My wife's side, a couple of my kids were born there. I'm in weekly contact with people in Ukraine, and that completely isn't the case. The churches are full, both Ukrainian Catholic and Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, and that's been the case for a long time. For a very long time. Persecution does that. You know, Tertullian said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and that is dynamically on display in Ukraine. You go to all of these countries throughout Europe, and church attendance is anemic. You go to Romania and Ukraine, perhaps the two greatest places of persecution, and church attendance is high. Now, I will say that vocations in the past 15 years have taken a significant downturn in Ukraine. That's true. Whereas we used to have 10 applications for an opening in a seminary in Ukraine, we now have 3 applications for every opening. So there's a significant downturn. That's true. But when you compare the popular piety and the bodies in churches in Ukraine, especially in Western Ukraine, which is the cultural and intellectual and religious center of Ukrainian public life, it is markedly higher than what you will find in Russia. Having spoken just recently with 2 Roman Catholic priests who were expelled from Russia, or voluntarily left before they were expelled, who lived there for more than 20 years. I can tell you, based on my extensive conversations with them, that, you know, church attendance in Russia is at best, according to their lived experience, at best 1.5% of the population. That's what you would find maybe in Belgium or in Spain. So that simply isn't the case. Russia, and I can answer more questions about the difference between the churches in Russia and Ukraine, but Russia's priests, up until a few years ago, a significant portion of the Orthodox priests in Russia weren't even Russian. They were imported from Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the conflict going on right now, or the invasion, basically, of Ukraine by Russia. Now, it's funny because I knew I wanted to ask you this question, and then I found your channel on YouTube, and I realized that you actually made a video on the anniversary pretty much addressing this very issue, but I still want to ask you it. It's to do with the reaction of conservatives to what is happening, and the unfortunate truth that there are some conservatives who who seem to sort of get drawn into this idea that, well, they're almost seeing themselves siding with Russia. And I think one of the reasons for that might be that conservatives, certainly in the West, have a general tendency to distrust the mainstream media and distrust mainstream narratives. So whenever there's something that seems to be said en masse in the mainstream media, whether that be to do with some gender ideology issues, transgenderism, or abortion, or COVID, whatever it is, they always feel like it's a narrative being pushed on them that they don't trust. And a lot of the time they find that narrative to be untrue or to be just complete nonsense. And because the Ukrainian Rushmore, the invasion of Ukraine has also been kind of, mentioned a lot by the mainstream media. They have supported Ukraine. I think sometimes conservatives then will think, they get suspicious. They say a broken clock is right twice a day. I think in this case, the mainstream media is just getting it right, basically, when they say what they say. But they kind of, they get suspicious. They'll see some videos. Some people seem to be promoting videos of Putin, saying some positive things about the family and all this stuff. And then they'll have some conspiracy theories about Zelensky and how he's pro-LGBT and all this. So what would you say to people like that who almost find themselves getting drawn into siding with Russia and thinking that this is all just some, Western kind of media propaganda that Ukraine is in trouble and that Ukraine is the good guy and Russia are evil? What would you say to those people that don't believe that?
Yeah. I tell them to be careful because we can be drawn into a horizontal worldview in which we see everything according to this timeline, and it's a lie. We as Christians have to see things with Christ as the center, and the example of that is found in the case of Nathaniel in John chapter 4, where Nathaniel is this contrarian, who says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Jesus says, before, when I saw you under the fig tree, and Nathaniel says, how do you know me? And Jesus says, uses this, and then Nathaniel goes from being a contrarian and a skeptic to all of a sudden being sent to being a believer and saying, you are the Christ, you are the Son of God. He goes from being a contrarian to being convicted. He goes from being 0 to 100 in a few seconds. And the other example that we don't have in that particular passage of the gospel is the example of, the Herodians and the Sadducees, who were conformists. And whatever Rome said, they did in order to, keep their affluent and comfortable life. And here, 2,000 years later, we fall into that same trap of being contrarians or being conformists. And we cannot be either. We are convicted sons and daughters of God. So we don't take our direction from the mass media. If the mass media, blows right, we don't wait until they blow right and then say, I'm going left. And if they go up, we don't say, oh, then I'm going down. Our focus, our direction, our chief navigator is Jesus Christ. And so we just follow him. So what we have are, there's a horizontalizing power over many of our conservative brothers and sisters who are simply contrarians. They simply look at what the left has done to our culture over the past 70, 80 years, which has been horrendous, and they simply go in the other direction. Well, that's going to help you a few times. You're going to get it right often enough, but you're not always going to be right. And you're going to make some big mistakes, in this case with Ukraine. You can look at things where the left has actually been right, which is you look at the situation in the Iraq War. Most conservatives sided with George Bush on that, and it turned out it was an unjust war. The one time, I think, in modern history where the left was actually right about something was on that. And look what it did to the Christian population, in Iraq, decimated it. And now you have an Iraqi government that has Sharia law in its constitution. Before it didn't. So So yes, this is the problem right now with conservatism, is that it's become very embittered. It's become it's like a jilted lover that has had its institutions destroyed, and they're out for blood, and they want to even the score, and that means just being Mr. No to everything that the media says and everything that the left does. That's not us. We keep our focus on Christ and the teachings that he gave us to the apostles and handed down to us for 2,000 years by the church. One of those teachings is simply from the time of Augustine, as he formulated it, down through Aquinas and Suarez and others, of the just war theory, that men and women are justified to use equal force to repel the unjust aggressor when all other means have been exhausted. And Ukraine fulfills every one of those requirements for a just war. Everything that Russia is doing at this point fulfills the requirements of an unjust war. So I hope that answers the question there, but it is there certainly is a contrarianism on the part of our brothers and sisters who are politically conservative on the issue of Ukraine. There's also a naivete on their part. Most of them don't know anything about modern Russian history, Eastern European history, Soviet history, and they are quick to go to a conservative talking point and to use that without knowing that those conservative talking points have been financed and influenced by the Russian intelligence community. You can look at the deep and profound influence of a Russocentric hegemonic view of history in Oliver Stone's movie documentary, Ukraine on Fire, riddled with lies and deceptions and just rewritings of history. And also, people are ignorant, I think, of how Russia has inherited the Soviet mentality. It's not as though the Soviet Union collapsed and all of a sudden all of these 130 plus million people in Russia became convicted, family-loving, Christ-loving conservatives overnight. That doesn't happen after 75 years of indoctrination, of re-education camps, of godlessness, and of gulags, that all of a sudden, the building collapses and you crawl out of it as a right-thinking man. There's a lot of damage there, spiritually, psychologically, culturally, and that has not been undone. And we see that by the low attendance levels. All of their bishops, I should have answered this earlier in your previous question, but all of the bishops in the Russian Orthodox Church are KGB agents. You can look this up in the Mitrokin files. KGB reports that were smuggled out in the 90s to England. The Mitrokin files, it details all of this. And what this demonstrates is that there is a pervasive problem in Russia, which refuses to come to grips with its history and instead tries to defend it. And we see this, for example, with the Russian war tactics of just throwing men without training, men into the trenches. Same tactic they used during the Second World War. And we see this in terms of propaganda, which is oriented towards a Western audience to create a fifth column. And we see this with the language of faith, family, and freedom. You'll see in Mr. Putin's public remarks, most recently last week, that he's intelligent and he takes the time and the focus to point out the West's current cultural implosion on issues of sexuality and faith. He spoke about the Church of England and the current theological catastrophe that is the Archbishop of Canterbury and the question of transgenderism and the way they've handled it. And he does that knowing that he's speaking to a Western audience that is hungry for that. What I'm getting at here, in a kind of circuitous way, I apologize, is that this was the same tactic used by Stalin, the exact same tactic used by Stalin. Stalin, at a point beginning in 1935 to 1943, made three very large concessions. He criminalized abortion, the first country in the world to legalize abortion, and Stalin goes out and criminalizes abortion. I think he almost totally criminalized divorce, which the communists had instituted. He taxes couples who don't have children, and in 1941 he creates this unthinkable movement known, which was the liberation of the churches. He took off all of the restrictions on the churches and endorsed the role of Russian Orthodoxy in the Soviet Union. It was unthinkable to the most hardcore communists that he would do this, but he did it out of survival. He did it out of survival because he saw the numbers. Behind ideology, there's always math. There's math and there's religion. And so Stalin passed this on, and this psychology has endured into modern Russia today. And Russia realizes that this is a civilizational existential battle, and they utilize religion as a form of soft diplomacy to get what they want, which is the recapitulation of a Russian empire. And the Russians, through the research of Anne Applebaum, we know, have funded both the far right and the far left throughout foreign countries to create destabilization. Anne Applebaum writes about this extensively. The timing of this is unfortunate because we in the West really struggle to find a political leader who's willing to speak boldly on issues of life and freedom and family. And Mr. Putin knows that. And to his credit, he speaks boldly on those. But we have to ask ourselves, what's his motivation? Like his predecessor, he's cagey and he's conniving. He understands the dynamics of the West's cultural implosion, and he is wise enough to employ that in the current war that is unfolding. The Russians have an advantage over the West in that from the time of the Tsarist Russia through the Soviet Union into post-Soviet Russia, they never repudiated, and nor should they have, religious diplomacy. You look at the British Empire, and I grew up in Canada, and you would have imperial schools, you would have an imperial church in Canada and in Hong Kong and in the Bahamas and in South Africa. The British used that religion and schools as a way to further the influence of the crown. It's not a bad thing, it was the accepted practice of the day, and I think I don't understand why secularism has done away with it, but Russia never did away with it, and so it co-opted the Russian Orthodox Church during the Soviet Union with Sergeyism in 1925. It co-opted the Orthodox Church for its purposes in both internally controlling its people and externally propaganda within the World Council of Churches and at the international level. And post-Soviet Russia has continued with that, with the using the church as a proxy of its foreign affairs ministry, and to further this theory, a neo-pagan theory of Ruski Mir, of a Russian world among its people and those in its satellites. So he's very cagey, and he's aware of this history, and he utilizes it. and to those of us in the West who are starving for a political leader who would speak with the conviction of a Constantine or something like that. People are falling hard for him out of desperation, and it's most unfortunate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. I mean, I think people, they just don't look deep enough into what is actually happening. Do they? They see they see the face of it and they think, oh, this is great what he's saying, and they don't actually realize. Surprising, because you'd think it would be quite known that Putin, former KGB agent, if you just look at Russia's history, as you've said, and learn a little bit about it, you can see what's happening here. You can see how strong and how good their propaganda is as well.
Yeah, Wojciech, I forgot to answer. I apologize. I forgot to say something about 2017. Is that when he's speaking intra and extra, there's a difference in Mr. Putin. When he's speaking extra, that's for the fifth column to weaken the conviction of the West, and by a weakened West, he's going to be able to do what he wants in his immediate sphere of influence, the Baltics, Ukraine. But when he's speaking intra to his audience at home, we see that his tone is different. So, for example, in 2017, when his party, United Russia, wanted to further restrict abortion, to their credit, to promote life, he would not back it. And his rationale was that he wanted to keep abortion safe, legal, and rare in Russia. Now, that's the logic and rhetoric of Bill Clinton, that on the left of the political spectrum. So if having virtual complete control of Russia for 20 years, if he wanted abortion completely outlawed, he could have done so long ago, because he had his own members in the Duma in 2017 pushing for a severe restriction, and he wouldn't do it. So that gives us an indication as to the lack of sincerity of the man.
Yeah. Okay, Father Jason, I think I'd love to chat with you again, actually, just about Russia, because I think that's another topic that we could just talk about an hour just about that. But I want to go briefly back to just the Eastern Catholic churches. I know in some of the videos you've put up on your YouTube channel, and I'll put a link to that channel below the video when I put it up, you've critiqued a few of the clergy who have basically been saying things or doing things that are a bit outrageous. Have you found any of this kind of stuff also in the Eastern Catholic Church and in Ukrainian Catholic Church? Are there any clerics that also say things that are heretical or border with the heretical, or is that more things that you can see in the Latin Church here?
No, in my 25 years, I have not encountered one Eastern Catholic hierarch who said something in an interview that approached anything that we're seeing from the Roman Catholic bishops, like Cardinal McElroy, like Cardinal Tobin, like the German bishops. No, not one.
It's not a problem that the Eastern Catholic churches have at the moment. That's what you're saying, and hopefully never.
Yeah, I mean, we have our problems. Don't think that we're holier than thou and that we don't have problems. But that particular problem of a successor of the apostles taking a public stance at complete variance with the teaching of the gospel, no, and it is to the collective shame of all Catholics, regardless of their ritual affiliation, that there are bishops in the church who shamelessly promote an alien religion And in doing this, they show that they are no different than the priests at the time of Isaiah. And in the face of such blasphemy, our Lord says to Isaiah that, your incense is repugnant to me. Your festivals are loathsome to me. It is, and it's not only to our shame, but it's also to the detriment of the faith in Africa and the Middle East, where Christians are struggling to exist, struggling to survive, and their Islamic confreres point to stuff like this and say, this is what your leadership believes. And this cowardice on the part of these shepherds compounds the crosses that our brothers and sisters are already carrying in places like Kenya, in places like Nigeria, in places like Pakistan. It's unconscionable and it's cowardly.
Yeah. Yeah, there was an example of it recently, actually, in Ireland, when a priest said some things during a sermon that were all in line with the church teaching. He was criticized for it, even by the bishop. And then when he was interviewed by someone on the radio later, that the radio host said, well, your bishop criticized you. Why did he do that? And the priest just said, I don't know.
I just want to say that, Basil the Great lived at a time when the church was just coming out of the darkness of her underground catacomb existence. And it was the dawn of what later came to be known as Christendom. And from that came a long day, a long summer's day. And like all days, it must set. And it set with the death of Christendom. And we are those who are at the dusk of Christendom. And there are glimmers of light. Those glimmers of light, when all around us seems to be an encroaching, darkening paganism, are the saints. And the saints are those who live a radical life of love for our Lord and faith and hope in Him. And they're anchored in that. And they don't take their direction from the blowing winds of this world, but they're convicted by the Son of God. At the time of Basil, there were Arian bishops and Catholic bishops. They looked the same, they smelled the same. Sometimes they even talked the same. But the only way that people could tell the difference between the Arian bishops and the Catholic bishops is that the Catholic bishops were willing to suffer. And so today, we have the same problem. There are the Catholic bishops, and then there are bishops who subscribe to another form, which is a part of a grand religious deception. And I'm not saying they're not bishops. They are, just like the Arians at the time of Basil the Great in the 4th century. But the way the flock will know the difference is that the true bishops, the true shepherds, will lay down their life for their sheep, as did the shepherd par excellence, Jesus Christ.
And on that more positive note, Father Jason, thank you very much for your time. That's all I'm going to ask you today, but I would love to have you back on again at some point in the future if you're willing to come back and chat with me. And God bless. Thank you.
God bless.